All right, thank you everyone again. I said a thank you message earlier, but for those of you who just joined in, this is the Research for Change event focused on social justice. We have two presentations today, as I mentioned earlier. I'm going to begin by introducing our first speaker. Her name is Annell. She is a first-year clinical psychology PhD student at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. She is also a recipient of the prestigious 2023 Martin Luther King Jr. Fellowship, which is awarded to outstanding incoming graduate students who are committed to the social justice principles espoused by Dr. King. Ovallis's research interests include examining the mechanisms of tailored treatments for pain, depression, anxiety, and PTSD, while focusing on marginalized communities and bridging the gap in mental health research, advocacy, and access. Today's presentation from her will focus on her current and future investigations. Current research focuses on investigating pharmacological interventions for the treatment of co-occurring pain and anxiety. Future research will focus on investigating how psychosocial factors among ethnic and racial minorities affect both anxiety and PTSD pathology and mechanisms of the therapeutic change in order to optimize treatment outcomes. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Annell. Annell, go ahead.
Hey, great. Thank you for that introduction, Emma. So let me share my screen. Okay. Sorry, Mike.
Are you having issues with?
Yes, hold on. It's not letting me. I think it's my. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, can you guys see my slides? Okay. Perfect. Okay, so again, my name is Annell. I am a current doctoral student in the clinical psychology program. I want to thank everyone for being here today. So first, I'm going to start off with a little bit of introduction about myself, as I feel that it really sort of grounds a lot of the work that I do. So I was born in the Dominican Republic in Santiago. This is a picture of the monument near my hometown. My mom, my sister, my dad, and I, we migrated to the Bronx, New York, early in 1999. And we lived in the Bronx all the way until actually I moved here to Boston. For my undergraduate degree, I went to, I think you're seeing my presentation view.
Yeah, sorry, I just got that message as well. Sorry, everyone. You'll change that
Sorry,
quickly.
let me see if I can. Oh, so sorry. Can you see this full now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. So like I was saying, so for my undergraduate degree, I attended Barnard College at Columbia University. While I was here, I majored in psychology and focused in Hispanic studies because I really wanted to combine a lot of what you guys will see throughout this presentation, my love for psychology, but definitely grounded in my interest for cultures. After I graduated from Barnard, I worked a couple years as a research assistant focusing on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But while I was there, I think one of the things that I kept seeing a lot was how difficult it was for individuals to gain access to healthcare resources. So that really interested me in sort of the larger question of how can we help individuals access mental health care? And sort of that's sort of what led me to seek my master's degree in public health first, prior to seeking my degree in clinical psychology. Hi. So before we jump in, I want to talk a little bit about sort of my research interests, and they have definitely broadened as my career has sort of progressed. But very broadly, one of the what I'm really interested in is social cultural factors and how social cultural factors affect pathology. I think right now I'm very specifically interested in anxiety, PTSD, and depression. And then sort of in connection to that, I'm really interested in pathology and sort of how cultural factors affect how these disorders present in minoritized communities. And I'm also really interested in immigration processes, such as assimilation and acculturation, which we'll talk a little bit about in a second, and how that, again, affects pathology in these disorders. And then ultimately, as a future clinician, I'm really interested in learning how we can improve treatment outcomes for minoritized populations in order to relieve burden of disease. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about my past research because I really do think it'll inform what my current research is and what I hope my future research here at BU will focus on. So my very first study is called The Effects of Acculturation on Latino Youth on Perceptions of Mental Health. So this was actually my senior thesis, and I really wanted to understand how processes of acculturation and cultural values affect perception of Latinos have towards mental health. So this study was a mixed method study, and I conducted 32 interviews with both non-Latino Hispanics and Latino participants who were students at Barnard and Columbia University. Again, very small study. And I really wanted to focus on 4 large themes: how mental health is discussed at home, understanding mental health. So essentially, how do Latinos, what do they think about mental health? What do they think mental health is? I also wanted to understand what were their coping mechanisms. And I really sort of narrowed it down to how they cope with stress at school and stress out at home. And I also focused on seeking professional help. On the side here, you'll see some of the quotes that highlighted a little bit of those themes, but essentially what we saw was that acculturation had very little effect, actually, in how Latinos perceive mental health. And what we saw is that there was a significant stigma, irregardless of acculturated status. And this study then sort of propelled me while I was in my master's degree. I really wanted to focus on understanding the disparities of use of mental health services, specifically in New York. So this was actually a 3-year project that I worked on that ended up being my master's thesis. And it's hopefully will be published in a couple of days. And so what I really wanted to understand was whether there was a significant racial disparity in healthcare in the United States, I mean, specifically in New York City. So for this study, we used the New York City Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And what we did was we specifically looked at the use of specialty mental health treatment. So that it could include visits to a counselor, a therapist, or any support group. So we really wanted to keep it very broad in comparison to psychiatric use of medication. And what we saw was that irregardless, there was less use of both services among Latinos and African Americans. But even further, we saw less use among African Americans. And one of the reasons that we kept seeing was that a lot of that had to be attributed, 1, to obviously insurance, and 2, which was really interesting, was the lack of services. I think for me, being from New York City and with all of the sort of availability that there is in New York, that was really shocking. But I think another thing that we found too, this survey was really great because it did ask in regards to stigma, that there was just a significant stigma towards seeking any mental health. And then sort of as the COVID pandemic sort of rise, I became really interested in, this is right at the height of the pandemic. There's a couple COVID related projects that I have here, so we'll talk a little bit about those, but I was really interested in how COVID-19 indicators and mental health outcomes, what those associations were. So this study assessed the prevalence of anxiety and depression symptoms associated with cases and mortality rates in the US between April and December of 2020. So inherently, I wanted to understand how, if there was an effect in the rise of cases and mortality rates, and how that affected anxiety and depression. What we found was that the estimates of depression increased significantly from 35 to 40%, and from 32 to 29 for depression, and 30 to 36% for anxiety. Even more specifically, we found that this was specifically more prominent in younger individuals, females and Hispanics, and as well as those with less than a high school diploma. Now, these are trends that after the pandemic we have been exposed to, and we keep discussing. So this was not shocking, but in the time, it definitely was. So, as I sort of mentioned in the beginning, I'm really interested in PTSD. This is actually a really unique project that I was allowed to collaborate on, because my interest does not only extend to minoritized population in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in sex and gender minority. So this study specifically investigated the role of shame-based cognition. So this is essentially individuals who was like, I'm not worth it. This is not worth it. I feel gross, or like I'm not worth love, and shame-based behavior. So that can be any avoidance or any self-harm behaviors on the relationship between post-traumatic symptoms and the relational between intimacy with women, sexual minority women. What we found was that shame-based cognitions were positively correlated with relational intimacy, I think, which resulted in high SPS wanting to lean more towards their partner for support. This is actually 3 months after a traumatic event, thus I think increasing the idea that that there is intimacy. And I think it's important for this to understand that we defined intimacy in a wide range, whether it was physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, and cognitive intimacy. And then we also found that at higher levels of SBC, the negative relationships between PTSS and relational intimacy was stronger, which underscored an important possible treatment for this population. So really focusing a lot on the cognitions more than the behaviors. This study is actually really unique and actually really special. I had the opportunity prior to coming to BU to be the PI of this project. And so this project is called a Neuro-Resource Facilitation for Improved Reentry for Adult Offenders with Brain Injury. So essentially what this project is targeting is the prevalence of brain injury in justice-involved populations. We often know that justice-involved populations are often undiagnosed and untreated. And this project, obviously, due to the composition of our justice system, does tend to mainly affect African-American and Latino populations. So this randomized trial is trying to determine if a case management intervention called neurorehabilitation facilitation will reduce recidivism in offenders with brain injury. So our main hypothesis is that individuals that have a brain injury and have cognitive impairment and who receive the NRF will actually improve, will reduce recidivism 3 years following their release. And one of the main goals of this project is not just obviously to reduce recidivism, but really educate prisoners, educate parole officers, and educate individuals that work within the prisons about brain injury and how to sort of assess when one of the inmates may have a brain injury and how that can affect their involvement within the justice system. This project similarly was very special for me. It kind of came off of one of the projects that I worked on while I was a project coordinator. So my main role was to conduct neurocognitive interviews, and this was at the height of the pandemic. And my main role was working with the Spanish-speaking population. And a lot of what kept coming up was how much individuals were struggling with the pandemic. So out of this project, it was the first time that I had to compete and apply for funding and sort of fund my own project and come up with my own questionnaire. So this is really exciting. And then we collaborated with the University of Texas, Rio Grande to expand and have a comparative sample. So this project in and of itself has now produced 4 different projects, but this one is very dear to me because it talks about interpersonal violence, not to be confused with intimate partner violence, among individuals with or without TBI during the COVID pandemic. And essentially what we found, and this here doesn't show sort of the racial breakdown, so I'm going to explain it a little bit, but on average, individuals with TBI reported a greater frequency and range of abuse than compared to the community sample. And what we did find actually was for Hispanics and African Americans, there was another increase specifically in verbal abuse. The only sort of concern that we had with this study, and one of the limitations was that we weren't able to determine, due to the way that the questionnaire was set up, was that we weren't able to determine if this was occurring pre-COVID and the duration of the abuse. And I think also one of the things that we hope, this article actually went into publication last night, so hopefully it does get published, is the need for there to be checking in with individuals with disabilities of any form about abuse or exposure to violence. Okay, we're almost there. This is another project that I recently worked on, and sort of going to allude a lot into the next sort of projects that I will be talking about is mental health symptoms as barriers to utilizing non-pharmacological pain management interventions. So we know that pain, specifically back pain, is highly prevalent and associated with lower quality of life. And I think due to the opioid epidemic, there has been a lot of push to find non-pharmacological interventions that will help treat treat pain. So we accessed the 2019 National Health Interview Survey. We decided to do 2019 because we didn't want to add the confounding variables of COVID-19. And what we found was that severity really was a predictor of individuals engaging with treatment. However, really focusing on Latinos and African Americans, what we found that not only was back pain a severity, but I think also socioeconomic status and insurance. So here we see that there was significant for yoga and Tai Chi, but that was not a trend that we saw with minoritized population. And a lot of that can be alluded to accessibility and cost of those treatments. Okay. So I'm sorry if I'm going fast. I just want to make sure I get the opportunity to cover everything. But my current research I started working on with my lab is sort of around that same vein, focusing on musculoskeletal pain, anxiety, and treatment preferences. So for my previous project, we talked a little bit about the push for more non-pharmacological interventions. So here we were examining the use of cognitive behavioral therapy as a strategy to treat the anxiety that sort of is very comorbid with pain, specifically musculoskeletal pain. So we wanted to understand how that can treat both the anxiety and the pain. What we found actually that participants systematically preferred face-to-face treatment versus app-based treatment or telehealth. So the study is actually right in its conception, and we're trying to we're going to focus on investigating how can pain predict treatment engagement and how we can improve individuals who don't get better in treatment so that they can continue coming to treatment. Okay. So for my future research, and a lot of these themes do align, is examine the mechanisms tailored for treatment, depression, anxiety, and PTSD. I think what I'm particularly interested in is understanding how psychosocial factors, so specifically one thing that's very common among Latinos is familialism and machismo, how those factors affect pathology. So, for example, how PTSD symptoms may present differently in someone who is from a Hispanic or African American background compared to another population population, and then taking it a step further and understanding. So now we know that these pathologies do present differently. How can we better improve the treatments to sort of address these differences in pathology? And sort of thinking through, I'm working with my advisor to sort of think about how we're going to sort of answer these questions in hopefully the next 4 years. So hopefully I'll be back in 4 years to present some results. But I think it's really important to address some of the challenges of conducting research with minoritized population. I'm going to try to keep it because I want to make sure I'm not running out of time, but this is something that I have come up with all of the research that I had mentioned previously, but there's significant mistrust of the medical community, especially in research. In one study that I worked on, I used to have to consent Spanish-speaking participants in the inpatient unit, and my colleague who consented individuals in the unit, she would be able to consent 3 people in the span of what took me to consent one Spanish-speaking family. So I think there's definitely a significant lack of trust in our medical community. And obviously, there's a lot of historical background to sort of explain that. Environmental concerns. Again, I think that housing, security, and how people get to our medical centers to conduct our research are some things that we need to acknowledge when we are conducting these research. Low socioeconomic status, it sort of also goes hand in hand with the lack of access to healthcare. Most of our research are conducted in medical centers, but it's important to acknowledge that a lot of individuals may not have access to healthcare and may not have access to resources that can get them to certain facilities. Language barriers, obviously, I think working a lot with Hispanic population, but I know this is also very common working with other populations. Oftentimes, most of the research, not all, are mainly conducted in English, and due to IRBs, it's very difficult to conduct these research in other languages. This is something also that's really, I have come up with a lot, is a lot of science and mental health literacy. There is such a lack within these communities that I've worked with. And so I think it is a lot of my job when I consent or when I talk to someone about research is first educating. And lastly, stigma and misinformation. And I sort of put those two hand in hand is my personal experience, and even coming from my own family, I think there is a lot of stigma towards mental health, but I think a lot of it is also fueled by a lot of misinformation that unfortunately can be perpetrated by family members or generational, or can be just a lot of self-stigma that we sort of build within ourselves. And so to wrap up, I do want to give a special thank you to my family and friends. My parents very specifically asked, because I never make them co-authors, to present a picture of them. I want to thank all my mentors across the years who have helped me to get to where I am. To all my amazing colleagues, I do want to give a special shout out to Adina, who was a co-author in a couple of my papers, who passed away last year due to cancer, and she was about to finish her PhD. So I hope I do her the honor of being able to finish it for her. And also to my BU clinical psychology cohort, we've only been together for 3 years, 3 months, but I want to thank you all for being so supportive and kind. And I think we're going to leave questions till the end, but here is my contact information.
Thank you so much, Annell. That was wonderful. As Annell said, we were going to leave the Q&A at the very end. We have some questions that were submitted in advance that we're going to address first, but we're also going to, address any questions that viewers have that they can write into the chat box. But we'll talk about that later. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Kaye-Alese Green. She is an MD-JD candidate at BU who received the highly competitive 2022 Whitney Young Jr. Fellowship. This fellowship is awarded in recognition of the civil rights pioneers' outstanding contributions in the fields of social work, urban studies, and African American studies. Green's research interests include pediatric trauma, medical education reform, and upstream drivers of health disparities. Her presentation, titled Pathologizing of People, will focus on the intersection of law and medicine, specifically how different kinds of structural oppressions are based on medical theory and applied through legal doctrine. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in interdisciplinary studies with a dual concentration in public health and urban education from the University of Central Florida. I'm going to hand it over to our presenter now.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. And to my co-presenter, it was a phenomenal presentation. I'm going to share my slides quickly and hope that those are visible to everyone. And so I want to start off just saying that this is longitudinal work. And so I'm diving in to a topic that really requires a week's worth of conversation at a minimum. It is such a large question, but I hope that you will journey with me as we sort of dig into this hidden world of law, medicine, and structural oppression. And before I begin, I just seeing professors and mentors and family on this call, just want to thank you for all of your sewing into me as I've been able to sort of dive into this study. So let's begin with the agenda for today. So what we're going to be navigating is the problem, the theoretical framework that I'm using, the methodology, the current research that I'm working on, our role in the transformation, and the future development of this work. This is the base of this work. It will be for my note, which for those who are non-legal people, it is essentially a legal thesis. It provides us the opportunity to do independent research in a specific area and really expand. And for me, I wanted to understand where my two worlds intersect and how they impact communities that are often divested and oppressed. A lot of this will have some interactive components, and so please feel free to engage in the chat with some of the questions and partner through as we discuss this. Also, just as a trigger warning, this is a topic that is just riddled with, uncouth is probably the too kind of a phrase, of stories and of phrases that were used in the past to describe groups of people that I'll be using in strong quotations to explain sort of where this work has evolved from and sort of how history has played into that. So just want to let people know that that is sort of where we'll be engaging with this work. So first, I want to start off with a rhetorical question. What does law, medicine, and structural oppression have to do with each other? And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll begin to recognize with me that they have everything to do with each other. And something else that I would like you to keep in mind as we navigate this presentation is this phrase. So on its face, the law is neutral and medicine is evidence-based. At the core of the law, we like to think of it as it is neutral. On its face, what does the law say? And we want the law to be rational and we want it to be able to be applied broadly. What sits above the Supreme Court is that there's equal justice under the law. We want it to be able to work for everyone. And we often want to believe for medicine that it's evidence-based. And I'm not saying at this presentation that these two statements are untrue, but I would like you to hold them a little bit looser if these are pure fundamental truths that don't have opportunity for question, and hold them in a way that says, maybe that's not the case all the time. And what does that mean if it's not the case in every situation? That the law, both in rationale and application, is neutral, and that medicine, both in development of the question and application of treatment, is always evidence-based. So here are two questions that I'd like you to think about and respond in the chat if you would feel like it. So question number one is, would you allow someone with this disorder, which I will explain, to vote or run for public office? This is a disorder that's characterized by a combination of neurological symptoms and psychoneuroses, including emotional excitability and disturbances of sensory, vasomotor, and visceral functions. Key symptoms of this disorder is anesthesia, amnesia, embulia, which, as I'm preparing for this presentation, was not quite sure the definition of. So for both your learning and mine, I'll give to you as a lack of initiative for action, speech, and thought, loss of motor control, and unstable personality or character. Would we say that this is someone we would like to have in public office or have the opportunity to win a public office? So just allowing you to think about that. And the second question is, should this be legal? Should it be legal for there to be sexual relations between two different species, which will result in an offspring that is susceptible to disease and psychological disorders? Additionally, there's little evidence to suggest that such an offspring would be able to survive or function appropriately in their natural environment. Would we think this is a good thing? And so let's go back to the first question. often I would say that I may question if someone is running for a public office who has an unstable character and who's unable to really function in society in a meaningful way. But when you think about that rationale in a more critical eye, you recognize that the definition I gave you is the disorder of hysteria. Hysteria comes from the word hystra, the Greek term for uterus. This is the disease of women. And the rationale for women not being able to vote, go into higher education, give presentations like this, be in public office is because we were inherently hysterical, inherently someone who was riddled with disease and unable to function in an intellectually meaningful manner or could be trusted. And so when we think about this disorder, when applied to a very specific population, intentionally, how does that change our understanding of, is this actually evidence-based, one, and is the law keeping certain groups out of participating in public life neutral at all? And the second one, which we'll spend much more time at through the presentation, is actually the rationale that was used for legally banning interracial marriage. The synonym that you'll see at the bottom is mongrelization. And when not used in the context of interracial marriage, mongrelization is only ever used as a term to describe a dog that has a set of breeding so far past the original breed that it cannot be understood as what it originally was. I hope it is as arresting to you for me to hear the words breeding and humanity in the same sentence, to be talking about marriage and animals as if they were equivalent. But yet this was where where a lot of the pushback against interracial marriage came from, was using rationales such as this to preserve a law because you were actually protecting the people. Because why would you want something that caused disease to be legally allowed in society? So using these two examples, I hope they hold in conscience for you as we go through the presentation, that some things are not as clear as they may seem. And so where I have come to as I begin to dig into this is that there's collusion in hallowed halls. The institution of medicine and the institution of law are legal systems for both America and I'd say every country in the world, are foundational components of what create a civilization. They are the groups of healing and structure. The body, in understanding the interworkings of the mind, has always been a revered career and path that has come with amazing power to do good as well as harm. And the law creates our structure. It encodes our morals. It provides rationale for what is good or evil and what is allowed or not allowed in a community. But yet, through those two examples, and hopefully through the rest of this presentation, you can see that that intersection is not always something that is as altruistic and doesn't always working for the good of everyone working for the good of everyone when they intersect. And so this has become my sort of question of what is here. There's collusion in these hallowed halls that I have the honor of standing in. And so the theoretical framework that I'm beginning to explore is this, is the canonization of social pathology. So starting on the right-hand side of the figure, the law. It has both external influences, but it also exists in this mutualistic relationship with medicine. Mutualistic being that both of the structures benefit from their relationship with each other. It is not quite symbiotic because they don't rely on each other to exist in every way, but there is a benefit in the push and pull of how they operate. So external influences into the law, changing government power, whether you are Republican, Democrat, Independent, we all can acknowledge that when a president from a different party takes power at the state level or at the federal level, we will see a different set of priorities. We see that in the legislative branch, and we also see that in the judicial branch, which is supposed to be a neutral body, that priorities begin to push and pull. The way that the law functions is the way it's interpreted and the way it is applied. And then there's advocacy. We all may be familiar with groups like the ACLU and people who are pushing to directly impact and change the law through different means, whether it is through lobbying or it is through actual court cases where they go and adjudicate, partner sort of in that method to change the law. But what I would like us to think about is the law is rational. It is coming and it demands evidence. You can't just proffer a statement with nothing behind it and expect for anything to be ruled in your favor. Evidence must be applied. So the law demands evidence. rights. And as we swing over to the left-hand side, that is where the institution of medicine comes in. So medicine, similar to law, has external influences. We have scientific advancement, which is a good thing. So hundreds of years ago, we as the broader society, that imbalanced humors is what caused people to be sick. So bloodletting and leeches was the treatment of the day. And I would like to say that we have moved past, and we have found more successful and meaningful treatments, that the imbalance of humors is not what makes us sick. And through technological advancements, being able to have blood smears and understand that even if there is a disease of the blood like leukemia or lymphoma, the thing that is going to cure you is not releasing the blood from your body. It is a different kind of treatment. But there's also a shift in societal values that makes medicine reconsider its diagnoses. Something that is both alarming and exciting, I guess maybe not be the right word, but alarming and true, is that hysteria was only removed from the DSM, so the Bible of Psychiatry, in 1980. So we think about that it was only untrue for women to, at a baseline, have hysteria applied as a disease that is predominantly associated with women in 1980. And let's think about that in a case that's very relevant here in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts has been a leader in same-sex marriage in the US. And something that was necessary for same-sex marriage to pass here in Massachusetts, and also to pass across the country nationally, is the fact that homosexuality had to no longer be a psychiatric disorder. So medicine had to redefine homosexuality as no longer something that was akin or actually perceived as disease, and readjust it to be understood as someone's identity, to allow it to be possible for the laws around marriage to change. They had to happen in tandem, because the law wouldn't say we're allowing a disease to spread rampantly. It goes against what the state's mandate is to do, which is to care for the citizens under its care. We had to find a way for medicine to say, we now recognize societal shifting values and calling forth for the humanity of a population, that we will no longer recognize their identity as a disease. And thus the law can take the objective affirmation, I put objective in quotes, affirmation of medicine, to say we can change the law, and the loop continues. So this framework is where I'm working, and I'm applying that to this methodology. So my research is, this research that I'm working on currently is really anchored in a qualitative archival study. And on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see that I'm looking through three major sections for medicine. One, foundational medical theory analysis, looking at the foundational medical theories and what are they actually saying? Because things that are now hundreds of years old, we often sweep under the rug of not understanding where the theory came from, even though we're continuing to apply its rationale and impact, and wondering why we're seeing disparities further down the line. Something that has been in the news very often is the way we use GFR and the way we use pulmonary function testing, of saying, where actually, and why do we actually have race in these medical calculators? Why are they there? And that requires us going all the way back to where those original theories were developed. Secondly, I want to do look at the doctrinal evolution through publication trends, looking at what JAMA was publishing in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. What was the institution of medicine standing behind? I wouldn't recommend this as a pastime for anybody, because it is quite alarming on what the institution of medicine has openly published in many prominent journals. And thirdly, I want to use a critical medical anthropology lens. I put anthropology in quotes because I am not a medical anthropologist nor medical sociologist, but really pulling from that tradition that is looking into saying, how do culture, society, and the people relate to their health, their well-being in the institution of medicine, and what are the cultural factors that intersect and cause that relationship to occur? On the right side of your screen, you'll see the legal buckets and sort of methodologies that I'm using in this qualitative archival study. I'm looking at a comparative legislative analysis. Our states, which are in the US, small sovereigns, we have little s sovereigns, and then we have our federal government, the big S sovereign. And that ability of having essentially a dual power system allows for each state to really customize in some ways the way it articulates and sort of governs its people and their laws. So when we'll get into some topics later, we'll see how the rules in California have not always historically been the same rules in Massachusetts or Georgia or Texas. And we'll begin to look at why and what was going on in those states at that time. Next is a doctrinal evolution via case law. How has the law evolved? And then lastly, using the critical legal studies lens, which is something that has become very near and dear to me, of really pressing into, let's understand what's under the surface of the perceived neutrality of the law. And how does that actual thing that we are finding under the surface impact people? This is all layered upon applying this archival study to modern ideologies and inconsistencies and social change movements and disparities data. So what do I mean by that? So let's think about redlining, something that has been well studied and fits very well at home within the social justice movements. In Boston, which can be thought of as a mecca of medicine in America, we have almost a decade of life expectancy difference in a 5-mile radius, depending on neighborhoods, that can be tracked or directly back to redlining lines. How is that possible that we have so many doctors per capita and we have some of the most phenomenal hospitals and researchers and institutes happening here, and we have some life expectancies that look more akin to a third world country than they do to being in a first world country, nevertheless being in a place that has such access to medical research and healthcare in general? How is that happening? What is the qualitative, what is the archival information, the historical perspective that gives sort of rationale for what we're seeing before us? So this structure is what has led me to what the current small slice of this topic is before us, and that is the concept of miscegenation. So you may be wondering, what is miscegenation and how does it have to do with anything? So you can see to the right of the collage is the state of Virginia's health bulletin. And this is in 1924. And this new Virginia law is to preserve racial integrity. This is written by Dr. Plecker, who you can see is an MD and is working in the state registrar for vital statistics in Richmond, Virginia. He here is explaining on why the races should not mix. And you're saying, Kate, miscegenation, we know interracial marriage, the Lovings, which is the couple you're seeing to the left of that collage. How does this all come together? So miscegenation is a really unique word that was actually birthed out of satire for people who were against abolitionists, and they wanted to create a word really out of mockery that then became a legal terminology. So miscegenation is made up of two words, miscere, which is to mix, and genus, which is species. So we're thinking to mix species. So the interracial marriage laws were not the ones that banned that. We're not saying we banned marriage. What they were actually saying is we ban the mixing of species. So they are saying that Mrs. Loving is a different species than her husband. She is a different kind of creature than Mr. Loving. And so that had to be rooted in a medical terminology because they're using biological taxonomy to make their argument. And when the state of Virginia was arguing their case in the Supreme Court, they pulled from the medical literature in ways that the Lovings, and when they were sending their briefs into the Supreme Court, had no need to do. So these are direct quotes from the state of Virginia's Supreme Court brief where they argued why the anti-miscegenation law should be upheld. They quote the American Journal of Medicine, which says, on the biological phase, there is an authority for the conclusion that the crossing of the primary races leads gradually to the retrogression and eventual extinction of the resultant type, unless it is fortified by the reunion with the parent stock. And Professor Engel from the University of Chicago, professor of physiology, said that the biological experiment of interbreeding cannot be undone without risk to civilization. When I stated at the beginning of the presentation that mongrelization was a term used by state senators, was a term used in public arguments against interracial marriage, it was not any bit of hyperbole. This was the term of the day to express people's incredible fear that if you allowed someone like me to marry someone like Mr. Loving and have a child, I would cause a degeneration of the white species. And it wasn't until the medical community came and said that Mrs. Loving is of the same species, is of the same kind of humanity that Mr. Loving was, that allowed for that law to be overturned. So why does this matter? Why does the intersection of medicine and law truly connect? And it is because if a state legislator can create an anti-miscegenation law, they use medicine's objective affirmation of a biological truth to instill a discriminatory practice. So the mutualistic relationship between medicine and law established centuries of constitutionally protected oppression. And you'd be saying, Kaye-Alese, that was the past. We have come a far way. And I must say, the fact that I am presenting this topic at a prestigious university, that I am in medical school or law school, we have come a very far way. But I want to also remind you that the Supreme Court case for Mr. and Mrs. Loving happened in 1968. My mother was born in 1953. And if my mother had been born in the US, she would have been illegal and would have been a crime because the marriage of her parents would have been not allowed by these anti-miscegenation laws. So one generation is really all we are discussing as the difference of the ability for Mr. and Mrs. Loving to be married now as to when this law was overturned in the 60s. So why have I decided to study and investigate such a concerning topic? And I think it is for three reasons. First of them being is that you cannot heal what you will not unveil. I deeply believe that we cannot begin to change the system and we cannot begin to really engage in the work of social justice if we don't know the dark truth about what's happening all around us and what has happened in the past and what salient and sort of insidious sequelae continue to impact people right now. And so the next point that has brought me to this is the concept of bearing witness. Judith Herman, who has done most of her phenomenal work and research, happened over in the Cambridge Health Alliance and is one of the stalwarts and mavens around PTSD and trauma therapy. And she stated this phrase in her prolific book, Trauma and Violence. She said, creating a protected space where survivors can speak their truth is an act of liberation. They remind us that bearing witness, even within the confines of that sanctuary, is an act of solidarity. And I think the thing that she reminds us even more to this day is that moral neutrality in the conflict between victim and perpetrator is not an option. That as we bear witness and bring forward this truth, saying that it just happened can't be where we land. We must move towards those who have been harmed and find ways to change the system so that harm doesn't move forward. And lastly, what I want to think about is the system will always produce the result it was designed to. There's the unfortunate truth that inequity was a foundational element of medical theories and the American legal system's design. But since it was designed in that way, I deeply believe that we can begin to do the work to redesign and create a new system and new systems that allow equity to be seen in every aspect of both the application of medicine and the application of the law. So you'd be asking, Kaye-Alese, how do we do this? I have three ideas for all of us. I think first is to choose. We have to choose to critically examine the data, the historical precedents and rationale. We have to acknowledge the setting and the outcome of the theory, law, or practice. And I challenge us to understand why more than what happened, because why something was implemented is almost more important than what was implemented, because that gives you a rationale of, is this actually neutral? Is this actually evidence-based? Why did we get here? And how did we get here? Next, I think we need to act. We are empowered, and I hope to empower people to actively engage your colleagues, your professional societies, and the arguments you use, and figure out if they are built upon flawed and dangerous rationale. What is the rationale for the pulmonary function test? Where did that come from? Where did over-policing come from? What was the rationale that said this was the policy for impoverished neighborhoods? Where is that being based out of? And next, I believe that we can redesign. We can and we must create a system that embeds equity. We have the opportunity. I believe in this, even on the Zoom, we have brilliance to take this forward and create a new structure. So for me, what does that look like? The future direction of my work is first to finish this thesis and to really dive in to the complex and dark and interesting world of miscegenation in the US and how it changes from region to region on what oppression looks like and who is banned. Next, I would love to look into women in hysteria. I think one for the dark satire of, as a woman, I find it truly fascinating about the theories that says my uterus moves about my body and can reach into my brain and cause me to do wild things. I find that as dark humor that I'm curious about, but I also want to understand how that has created glass ceilings for women for centuries. And lastly, understanding how poverty and criminality really intersect that causes a deeper level of oppression on divested communities, and how that was both institutionalized from a medical perspective in psychiatric hospitals and just institutionalization, but also from a legal perspective. There's a famous case that we don't want 3 generations of idiots. And this is said from in the courtroom from a judge on why sterilization of a woman outside of her consent was justifiable. So how does this intersection between medicine and law and oppression continue? And I know we want to save time for questions, so I just want to thank the Office of Research and all of you for your attention and just the opportunity to share this important work and sort of where this work is going. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Kaye-Alese. Super fascinating. I too am very interested about how hysteria affects women. It's a little bit ironic seeing it in this present lens as well. So as I mentioned earlier, Q&A is reserved at the very end. We had some questions submitted in advance, but if you have any questions you would like to submit now based off either Annell or Kaye-Alese's wonderful presentations, feel free to drop it in the chat box, and I will read those after we address these first 3 that were submitted in advance. So Annell and Kaye-Alese, feel free to answer either one of these if you have an input for this question. The first one that we got was, can you share some of the challenges you faced during your research, and how did you overcome them to make a meaningful impact?
Go first. I think I talked a little bit about at the end of my presentation of some of the challenges of getting minoritized populations to participate in research. But I think one of the challenges that I have also found is finding mentors that I think often that can relate to sort of a lot of my personalities and my intersectional personalities. So I think one of the ways that I definitely sort of have confronted both of them, overcome those, is definitely reaching out outside of your comfort or outside of your bubble. There's definitely people, one of the wonders of social media is definitely that there are a lot of people who are willing to help in any way possible. And I think when it comes to working with minoritized populations, my public health degree really did a lot of work on really knowing that a lot of the work begins with communities, and really going back to the communities and giving a lot of the research back, which I think that now research is really doing a great job to sort of circling, but I think there's definitely more work that needs to be done there.
Thank you for that.
Oh yeah, sure. I second very much what Annell was saying. And I also think often these conversations haven't been researched for a reason, in the sense that they're quite taboo. There is a hesitancy to acknowledge what's happening. And so I think I almost would say my encouragement is to continue to sort of be bold, to press into the thing that matters to you, and to find a way to both assuage the fear of like, oh, did we do that? I think I find a lot of in the work that I'm doing, and find that way to say like, we did, but we also can change. How do you always pivot towards the hope that doing this work that can be very tender and close to home actually gives greater opportunity to create a different narrative and future moving forward?
Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, how can graduate students outside of your field, so just for some context, this is related to the social impact and social justice focuses that both of your academic and professional interests lie in. So for students outside of those, how do they get more involved in activism and social work? And what are your thoughts about that?
I guess I can start off for this one. You can be anywhere and do social justice and advocacy. One of my favorite stories that I will tell is there's a chef who that's not where you think social justice is going to happen. And there was a community that was hurt by an earthquake that was based in the agriculture, and they did cheese. And he created a recipe, being a famous chef, so that community didn't die by not being able to sell their crop. And that saved a generation. So thinking of that is every discipline needs advocates. There's always unheard voices. So I would encourage you very much to what Annell said. Social media is a great way to find out who's doing something about what needs to be done. And if you don't know where to start, I would encourage you to start it. Start the conversation, bring like minds together, because I'm doing this work in medicine and law, that doesn't mean that everything in the arts is fine. That means that I just am not doing the work there, but I'm so empowered when I see other people doing the good work in other spaces.
I also think, like, especially right now, it can feel very challenging, and it can feel that there's so much going on. But I think it's important to know that speaking out, creating art, or writing things that are meaningful can move the needle even in the smallest way. So I think very much, to echo what was said, I think it's just, you can do it in so many different ways, and it's just about getting yourself out there.
Thank you so much for that. We just had one more question. I think this may be more specific to Annell's presentation. Are there any differences between pain management techniques between Black patients versus Caucasian patients?
Yeah, I think on a lot of, I have just sort of started dipping into this field, but I think one of the main things that I found is that a lot of the pain management is very much rooted in sort of resources. A lot of my research has focused on non-pharmacological interventions, but it's important to acknowledge that a lot of non-pharmacological interventions are not covered by insurance, such as yoga and Tai Chi. I think, for example, the VA is now doing a really good job of incorporating it into their care, but if you're not a veteran or served in the military, that's really hard to access. And it's also important to think about that, it does require time and energy. And oftentimes, as we know, a lot of individuals, African Americans and Latinos and minoritized populations, may not have the time to work, go to work, take care of kids, and then sort of go to a 1-hour yoga class. Or so I think it's important to sort of think about how we can eliminate those gaps, and maybe how to incorporate those non-pharmacological interventions more into a healthcare setting that is covered by insurance. So I think there is definitely a lot of movement going on right now, and then there's a lot of conversation that sprouted very much after the opioid epidemic, but I think there's a lot more conversation that needs to happen.
Thank you for that. And Kay, just to wrap up, because I know some of the stuff that Annell touched on has some legal and medicinal standpoints, so I'm curious if you have anything to add before we wrap up this event.
I think Annell's final point is so key of the non-pharmacological is not a synonym for free. And I think we often think if you're not paying for medication, paying for intervention is just very different. And I think creating both the awareness of how culture impacts what people think is even a reasonable non-pharmacological treatment plays directly into reimbursement structure and even into what medicine thinks is reasonable. Is your doctor going to be like, oh, Tai Chi? Like, and then you more likely won't do that intervention, even if there's research to back that is a very viable thing. So I think that her point of how do we create environments that are equitable requires the law to help to reimburse on the healthcare side, and medicine to be open to recognize that beyond prescriptions, they are really important treatment modalities.
I completely agree with you. That is super important. Thank you both so much today for your wonderful presentations, and also for answering the questions that were submitted in advance. Thank you all for attending as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to our email. I'm going to drop my email in the chat box if you have any questions, but if not, thank you all for attending, and I hope you all have a lovely evening. Goodbye.